It was a late Friday evening, and I sat in my office, reviewing candidates for the open regional director position. My responsibilities felt heavy. Our company produced eco-friendly chemicals for soil management, helping farmers maintain sustainable food production through better fertilizer and water control. We took pride in our environmentally conscious approach in an industry often lacking such a focus. Adding to my current workload, 2 office staff members were leaving soon due to their spouses' out-of-state promotions, meaning I needed to fill their positions quickly. On the plus side, our Midwest sales team, spanning 8 states, had surpassed its yearly targets, a major win. Ruby, my executive assistant, briefly interrupted. "Stanley, all 8 candidates confirmed their Monday interviews. I'm leaving for the evening." She gave a quick wave and was gone. Every Thursday, I traveled to a different state in my region for half-day sales meetings. By Friday evening, I was typically driving home. Mallory, my wife, used these nights for socializing, accumulating a hefty babysitting tab over the years. However, these trips were crucial for connecting with our sales representatives, improving their performance, and resolving any challenges. This direct engagement had paid off. We hadn't had a sales rep resign in 8 years, a near miracle in this industry. I just arrived back at the office to complete a few tasks before heading home. The company had suggested I delegate these trips, but I appreciated the quiet time they provided. Between Mallory, who always seemed to be in the loop about everything, and our 3 kids, the peaceful hours on the road offered a rare chance for reflection. Furthermore, I was budget conscious, and these trips saved the expense of a dedicated sales manager. Our eldest, Olivia, was graduating high school and heading to university in the fall with a full scholarship, a huge financial blessing. Sophie, our youngest, was 16 and preparing for her learner's permit. As a family, we were in a good place. Mallory and I had been married for 2 decades. She worked as the executive assistant for the district attorney, who had recently accepted a high-paying federal job. He was around my age, but a lifelong bachelor. There were always whispers about him, but I never gave them much credence. For the last 15 years, my parents had generously watched our kids every other weekend, giving Mallory and me much-needed time to reconnect. Their support was likely instrumental in preserving our marriage through tough times. With Olivia set to intern at a senator's office in Washington, D.C. this summer, that era was coming to a close, but it had been a tremendous help. A while back, my dad had purchased Ancestry DNA kits for all 3 of our children, with my consent. We sent them in, curious to see if any unknown relatives might surface. Olivia, ever playful, decided to keep the results a secret from her mom until they arrived, knowing they might take several months. This weekend, Mallory had planned a trip to Memphis for us to attend a concert at the Orpheum. We'd be back by Sunday. She always had a knack for creating special memories. I'd met Mallory during my senior year of college, though not in a particularly romantic way. I was selling snacks at a football game. Her father was on the medical team for the team, so she always had free tickets. That day, she was there with a date, and they started arguing over some minor issue. The argument escalated, and as she pushed her date away, he stumbled into me, sending my tray of snacks flying down the concrete stairs. I woke up in the hospital with my head bandaged. The doctor told me I'd needed 25 stitches to close a deep cut on my forehead, and that I'd been in a coma for a week due to internal injuries. Mallory, burdened by guilt, visited me every day during my coma, even meeting my entire family. As I began to regain consciousness, I saw a luminous figure, almost angelic, standing by my bed. It took a moment to realize it was Mallory, not a vision from the afterlife. Standing beside her was my then-girlfriend, Lindsay. I remember feeling disoriented and, honestly, a bit let down to see Lindsay. I drifted in and out of consciousness, and when I finally woke up properly, Lindsay was gone. Mallory remained steadfastly by my side throughout my recovery. Our relationship developed gradually after that, though it was never formally defined. 3 months later, we were married. I'll always remember how stunning she looked walking down the aisle, 5'8", with long blonde hair, captivating blue eyes, and a figure that drew every eye. By our 5th anniversary, however, Our relationship had encountered difficulties. We even briefly considered separating, but somehow we managed to stay together. One day, leaving Charlie's Bar and Grill, a restaurant more known for its bread roll tossing gimmick than its food, though it reminded Mallory of her mother's cooking, we had a conversation that unsettled me deeply. Mallory suggested I have an affair, explaining that marital norms were changing, and it might even improve our understanding of each other. I was utterly speechless. Her suggestion felt selfish, manipulative, as though she was giving me permission to hurt someone else for our own supposed benefit. I finally asked, "Why would you want me to cheat? Have I done something so wrong that you're hoping this will end our marriage?" The car was filled with a heavy silence. Mallory, usually so quick to respond, said nothing. After several minutes, I turned the music back on, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was profoundly wrong. About an hour later, still on the road, and about 40 miles from home, she turned the music off again and apologized. "Stanley, I'm sorry. I think I've just been reading too many of those silly romance novels. I don't know what I was thinking." Then she turned the music back on, as if everything were normal. But the thing is, our kids and I knew she hated those books. They had been her mother's guilty pleasure, but Mallory had always dismissed them as trashy and beneath her. Her explanation simply didn't make sense. As we neared home, I realized there was one aspect of her life I'd never really questioned: her Thursday night outings with friends. It had always seemed harmless. On the rare occasions I was home on a Thursday, she'd skip her outing to be with me. But now, after that strange conversation in the car, I began to wonder if there was something more to it. Was she really going out to bars with friends? Was she involved in something questionable? By the time we pulled into the driveway, I was determined to get to the bottom of it. Later that night, after we'd settled in, I spent some time with my parents. They mentioned they wanted to talk to me privately the next day, hinting at concerns about Mallory and our youngest daughter, Sophie. I wasn't sure what they meant, but I agreed to meet them around 3 o'clock after my job interviews the next morning. I told Mallory I'd be at my parents' place in the afternoon, and she seemed fine with it. We were having a serious conversation after stopping at Charlie's Bar and Grill on the way home. The food was forgettable, but the place reminded Mallory of her mother's cooking. Out of the blue, Mallory suggested I consider having an affair. She claimed marital norms were evolving, and that infidelity might somehow strengthen our bond. I was stunned. Her proposal felt incredibly selfish and manipulative, like she was granting me permission to hurt another person for our own gain. I couldn't contain my disbelief. "Why on earth would you want me to cheat?" I asked. "Have I done something so terrible that you're hoping this will destroy our marriage?" An awkward silence descended. Mallory, normally quick with a reply, said nothing. After a few minutes, I turned the music back on, but a nagging feeling of unease persisted. About an hour later, still driving and roughly 40 miles from home, she switched the music off again and apologized. "Stanley, I'm so sorry. I think I've been reading too many of those ridiculous romance novels. I don't know what I was thinking." Then she turned the music back on, as if everything were fine. But my children and I knew she despised those books. They were her mother's guilty pleasure, but Mallory had always found them trashy. Her excuse rang hollow. As we approached home, I realized there was a part of Mallory's life I'd never scrutinized: her Thursday night outings with friends. They'd always seemed harmless. On the rare occasions I was home on a Thursday, she'd always skipped her outing to be with me. But after that unsettling conversation, I started to wonder. Was there more to these outings than she'd let on? Was she going to bars? Was something else going on? By the time we parked, I was determined to uncover the truth. Later that evening, after settling in, I spoke with my parents. They said they wanted to talk to me privately the following day, expressing concern about Mallory and our youngest daughter, Sophie. I was unsure what they meant, but I agreed to meet with them around 3 p.m. after my interviews. I told Mallory I'd be at my parents' in the afternoon and that dinner might be late. She didn't seem bothered. The next day, my parents came to my office. After some initial small talk, my dad got straight to the point. "Stanley, I truly regret buying those ancestry kits for the grandkids. We got a match. Sophie has a paternal grandmother who's been searching for her son and his descendants." He handed me a form from Ancestry.com with a woman's name and phone number. My heart sank. My dad's expression confirmed his understanding of the implications. "Dad, I don't think this is a coincidence," I said, taking a deep breath. "Let's see what we can find out." I dialed the number on the office phone, put it on speaker, and started recording the call. "This is Stanley Spencer. I'm looking for Sylvia Tate regarding a DNA match through Ancestry.com, I explained. "You're speaking with her," the woman replied. "How can I help you?" I hesitated for a moment, then said, "This is complicated, but I've just learned that my youngest daughter, Sophie, is your granddaughter." "Are you referring to Sophie Spencer?" she asked, curiosity in her voice. "Yes," I confirmed. "Then perhaps you know my son, whom I had to give up for adoption when I was 15, Mrs. Tate continued. "I might if I knew his name," I replied. "He was adopted by a family with the last name Harper. His given name was Andrew," Mrs. Tate revealed. My stomach dropped. My parents and I instantly recognized the name. Her words were like a nightmare unfolding. "He's alive and well," I said, still reeling from the shock. "He's the district attorney here in Butler County, and also my wife's boss." "Now it all makes sense why he never married," Mrs. Tate confessed. "He's my only child. I'm battling stage 4 lung cancer and don't have much time left. Would you allow Sophie to visit me before I pass? I'll cover all expenses. I just want to meet her and leave her my estate." "Given the circumstances, I'll have my parents coordinate a visit this weekend," I agreed, knowing I couldn't let Sophie travel alone. "Is there anything else you need?" "Please provide a notarized statement for my lawyer to conduct a DNA test," Mrs. Tate requested. "He'll want to verify her identity before altering my will, considering the size of the inheritance." "No problem," I assured her. "I'll hand the phone to my dad, and he can discuss the details with you." I left my office and handed the recorder to Ruby, my executive assistant. "Transcribe and notarize both my conversation and the phone call. This will be essential for the divorce proceedings. Should I also prepare the authorization for the DNA test?" Ruby, demonstrating her astute understanding of the situation, asked. "Yes, please," I replied, "but keep it confidential for now." I told Ruby to keep the information quiet for now. I needed a few weeks to investigate my soon-to-be ex-wife's Thursday night activities. Turning to my assistant Mark, I said, "I'll need your and your wife's help with a personal matter." My tone conveyed the seriousness of the situation. "Sadie's almost finished with her dispatch calls. I'll text her to come over immediately," Mark responded, sensing the gravity of the situation. Back in my office, we finalized the plan. Mark and Sadie would use their spare key to my house to pack some clothes for Sophie. The following Friday, I would take Sophie out of school and drop her off at their place by 10 o'clock a.m. After seeing my parents off, Sadie arrived. I directed her to Mark's office and joined them shortly. Meanwhile, Ruby had already transcribed and copied the documents. I handed Mark and Sadie a copy of the recorded conversation with Mrs. Tate. I gave Ruby the paperwork for my dad and instructed her to make additional copies for the lawyer. Mark and Sadie, close friends, were deeply affected by what I was going through. Sadie had grown up next door to Mallory, and the truth about my wife's actions left them both stunned. We brainstormed ways to uncover more information. My plan was for Mark to use my company car for sales trips, while Sadie used Mark's car, pretending to cross-train for the next few months. During that time, I would discreetly follow Mallory on Thursday nights to gather evidence. My suspicions were intensifying, especially after her suggestion that I have an affair. I was starting to believe she was planning to leave me for Andrew Harper, and the affair would be her justification for divorce. Sadie agreed, and even suggested involving the police to collect more detailed evidence. She had a contact who could help. Later, Ruby informed us about George Thompson's departure from the DA's office and his move to private practice. Sadie asked me to give George her regards when I saw him. We formulated a plan to gather further information, and then I left to meet with George. He was a lawyer known for his work in the women's rights movement, often challenging established legal precedents. His unorthodox approach was making waves. As we talked, things began to fall into place. My marital problems with Mallory had started around the time she began working for Andrew Harper, which also coincided with my promotion and increased travel for work. If they were having an affair every Thursday, I had been oblivious to it for over 15 years. The expensive gifts Andrew had given Mallory now seemed much more suspicious. George was prepared when I arrived. Sadi had already briefed him on everything. He gave me access codes to Andrew Harper's house, including the alarm code. He also provided a phone number for a team of professionals who could discreetly assist me. George, having grown up in a tough neighborhood, still had connections for handling things quietly. The access codes were valid until the end of the week, at which point Andrew would be reminded to change them. George had also devised a strategy to sue Andrew for back child support for Sophie, potentially bankrupting him under state law. He suggested I temporarily transfer parental authority of Sophie to my parents until the court proceedings were over, to avoid any accusations of manipulation. When I offered to pay George up front, he refused, saying it might alert Mallory. Instead, he asked for a check that could be cashed once the legal proceedings commenced. I left feeling confident that George had my best interests in mind. I finalized the paperwork, granting my parents temporary parental rights over Sophie, effective Friday. They agreed it was the best course of action after George and I explained everything. Later, Sadi arrived in her 2002 Ford Taurus. Since Mark was on his first sales trip, she left her car with me and took Mark's home. My eldest daughter, Olivia, texted me to say that Mallory wasn't coming home for dinner. She was going out with friends. Once Sadi arrived, we swapped cars, and I packed my suitcase. "Stanley," Sadi said, "the team's ready. Just tell me where to go." "Thanks," I replied. "George wants me to call him when it's time so he can serve them personally." I couldn't help but wonder about George's apparent vendetta against Andrew. "He's all about principles," Sadi explained. "Andrew is notorious for not keeping his promises." Later that night, I watched as Mallory and Andrew left their offices in separate cars and met for dinner at Charlie's Bar and Grill. Afterwards, they drove off separately again. I followed Andrew home, parking where I had a clear view of his house without being seen. Mallory arrived first, using the alarm code to enter. Moments later, Andrew pulled up, and they greeted each other at the door with a passionate embrace. I stopped recording as they disappeared inside. George's team had wired 6 rooms in Andrew's house with audio and video, courtesy of a neighbor's son, who, despite serving time, still had connections. Everything was streamed live on a private web page, providing undeniable proof of their affair. Around midnight, my daughter Olivia called, distressed. "Mom's not home, and she's not answering her phone," she sobbed. "Call Andrew," I instructed her. "Insist he put Mallory on the phone." "Why?" Olivia asked, confused. "Because he's been her Thursday night companion for years," I replied. "Over 16 years," I revealed, sending her the clip of Mallory's encounter with the police earlier that evening. Olivia quickly grasped the devastating betrayal. After sending the clip, I asked her to unlock the front door, as I was on my way back to confront Mallory. Meanwhile, George called to inform me he had served restraining orders on both Mallory and Andrew, barring them from coming near us. As I pulled into the driveway, Olivia opened the garage so I could park Sadi's car inside. "Olivia," I said, "remember the locksmith who changed the locks? It was all part of the plan." The plan had been prompted by the DNA test results, revealing Sophie's biological connection to Andrew Harper. Olivia was visibly shaken, and I held her close until she regained her composure. We retreated to the kitchen for privacy, where I played the recording of the car conversation Mallory and I had after returning from Memphis. It gave Olivia a first-hand understanding of her mother's manipulative behavior. "Why would Mom encourage you to cheat?" Olivia asked, tears welling in her eyes. "To deflect attention from her own actions, in case they were ever exposed," I answered. Ironically, her suggestion led directly to the truth coming out. Before we could continue, there was a knock at the door. A police officer informed us they had intercepted a taxi with Mallory inside. She had been warned about violating the restraining order and was forced to turn back. That night, Olivia and I talked for a long time. She was stunned that her mother had been having an affair for over 16 years. "How did we not see it?" she asked, struggling to process the revelation. I explained that it was easy to miss, given our busy lives. The kids were young. I traveled frequently, and I had completely trusted Mallory. Olivia nodded, realizing the depth of her mother's deception. "You were played, Dad," Olivia pointed out, highlighting the most painful part, that Mallory had exploited our trust to maintain her affair. As Olivia made coffee, the first rays of dawn appeared. Just then, I received a text from Mallory, urgently requesting to talk about something related to Olivia. I decided to respond after reassuring Olivia. I declined Mallory's attempt at manipulation, telling her she could continue her plans with Andrew Harper, but without the children. I explained to Olivia that her mother had suggested I have an affair not to repair our marriage, but to use it against me in divorce court. Mallory never expected to be exposed after all these years. I could see how difficult it was for Olivia to accept this truth. People often struggle to confront painful realities, but eventually they must come to terms with them. I held my daughter as she cried again. We had just calmed her down when my other children, Elliot and Sophie, woke up. I switched on the kitchen TV for the morning news, and they joined us for breakfast. Everyone was surprised to see me home. Then, to our shock, Mallory's image flashed on the screen. My son turned up the volume. My heart broke for my children as they listened to their mother and Andrew laughing and mocking me, calling me foolish and naive. Mallory made a sarcastic remark about me, causing them both to burst into laughter. The reporter, however, interjected, saying they were probably not laughing anymore, as their scheme to set me up with an escort had backfired spectacularly. The scene shifted to George Thompson serving lawsuits to both Mallory and Andrew. The reporter provided details, and Sophie broke down in tears, running to sit on my lap. It was a harsh and abrupt way for her to learn that Andrew, her biological father, was not her dad, but her mother's longtime lover. Elliot summed it up well, asking what their mother's attitude toward me said about how she truly felt about them. Once Sophie calmed down, Olivia and I explained everything that had happened since Mallory and I returned from Memphis. I arranged for them to be excused from school on Friday and Monday, giving them time to process everything. Just as we were about to eat breakfast, Sophie exclaimed that the police chief was on the news. We turned up the volume. The chief publicly announced that Mallory Spencer and Andrew Harper, our district attorney, were under criminal investigation. A special team from outside the county was leading the inquiry. I reflected on how quickly private actions could become public scandals, and how unforgiving society can be when people like Mallory and Andrew are exposed. After breakfast, I asked the kids to sit at the table. I showed each of them a copy of the letter my dad had received from the Ancestry DNA match. Then I said to Sophie, "Your grandparents are going to pick you up so you can meet your biological grandmother. She's very ill and has requested to see you. There's an important reason for this meeting, but I think it's best she explains it herself." I added, "As far as I'm concerned, you are, and always will be, my daughter. If you have any questions, feel free to ask your grandparents." I then asked Olivia to help Sophie pack for the weekend, while I called my parents. As the girls left, Elliot turned to me and asked, "How are you holding up, Dad?" I'm struggling," I admitted to Elliot, "but I'm doing my best to stay composed. Remember, son, if you're ever in this situation, as a father, you have to stay strong for the people who depend on you." With that, I called my parents to explain the situation. They said they'd come over as soon as they finished packing. They had about an hour before their flight. In that moment, something shifted in my relationship with Elliot. We connected in a way we never had before. The three of us watched as Sophie, the daughter I had raised, left with my parents to meet her biological grandmother for the first time. I prayed things would go well, and that Sophie would still see me as her father when she returned. Meanwhile, at the district attorney's office, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Mallory had gone to buy new clothes after having her car towed and the tires replaced. Andrew was busy reviewing the lawsuit George had served him. Though they lacked a direct DNA sample, the biological connection to Sophie was undeniable, and Andrew couldn't refute it. The truth about their relationship and the fact that Andrew was Sophie's biological father was now public knowledge. It was a political nightmare for both of them. Fraud, under the law, now included failure to disclose key facts, and George had used this to sue both Mallory and Andrew in a civil suit. It was clear they had been deceiving me for years. Even though several lawyers believed George and I had a strong case, no one was willing to get involved, likely due to George's formidable reputation in court. The exposure of their behavior on Facebook, including their plan to ruin my life, had become headline news, especially considering my standing in the community. Mallory, a regular at a nearby clothing store, was confronted there by a woman who accused her of being insane and said she should have seen the consequences of her actions coming. The woman was referring to the compromising photos of Mallory that had surfaced on Facebook. Later, when Mallory returned to Andrew's house, she noticed a company finishing a service call. Assuming she was the homeowner, they mentioned resetting the security codes. Only later did she realize there had been no electronic signature verification. Mallory called Andrew, asking who might be trying to sabotage his new position in St. Louis, and filled him in on what she'd discovered. They both suspected this was about more than just me protecting myself. They believed there were political motivations involved. As Mallory made coffee, she reviewed the divorce petition I had filed. It stung to realize her own words had led to my suspicions. Her suggestion that I damage other lives had given me the clues I needed. On top of that, the DNA match from Ancestry.com had exposed the truth about Sophie's parentage, threatening to tear our family apart. Long before Sophie was even born, she realized, I had orchestrated the events of the previous night, revealing all the hidden truths about her life. As she took another sip of coffee, the doorbell rang. It was Mr. Harrison, the neighbor Andrew disliked. "Mr. Harrison," she greeted, "what can I do for you?" Handing her a legal envelope, he explained, "Stanley used my place as a base for everything last night. I let him, gladly, after Andrew Harper got my son sentenced to the maximum. The information in this envelope will be shared with the rest of your family today as well. Stanley asked me to find out if you're still laughing at him." Mallory took the envelope back to the kitchen and opened it. Inside were incriminating photos, images of her entering Andrew's house with her key, greeting him at the door, and engaging in intimate activities, all captured on camera. It also included footage of her confrontation with the police. The final document was a signed letter from me, revealing the potential public fallout that could severely damage her future. "By the time I returned from Memphis," the letter read, "it was clear you were planning our divorce. I've spent days trying to understand what turned your affection for me into such animosity. I now realize you blame me for what you see as the failings in your life, especially during the time when we had only 2 children. You felt trapped in our marriage, longing for your carefree single days. That's why you turned to another man, to relive the freedom you once had. You remained in our marriage not because you loved me, but because Andrew didn't want the responsibility of raising children, not even his own. You couldn't leave the kids with a man you saw as worthless, so you stayed, living a lie for years. Every time you and Andrew avoided the consequences of your actions, your hatred for me grew. How much did you two laugh at my expense? Did belittling me make Andrew love you more? What I cannot forgive is the message you and Andrew have sent to our children. It will shape their lives forever. I've yet to fully understand how much amusement you both got from manipulating me and using our children like pawns on a chessboard." The KVX news reporter summed it up perfectly. "Are you still laughing at Stanley Spencer? I watched Olivia, Elliot, and Sophie as they—" I received a heart-wrenching letter from Andrew, mocking me after his TV appearance. He relayed our son Elliot's sentiment that, at best, I'm considered garbage in Andrew's eyes. The letter questioned what this implied about Andrew's view of our children, and concluded by accusing me of destroying our children's relationship with him, while celebrating his and Mallory's ability to brand me a fool. Mallory's hands trembled as she read the letter, dropping the papers. Bitterness consumed her, demonstrating a lack of concern for me, our children, or anyone else. Her selfishness and self-serving motivations were evident. Tears welled in my eyes. I had a knack for identifying people's flaws without outright condemnation, and my words had struck a nerve. I recognized her actions as attempts to maintain her lifestyle, not driven by love. I also suspected Andrew had been pushing her to leave me and the kids long before Sophie's birth, but his new job accelerated their plans. Mallory's laughter had ceased. She knew I had exposed their scheme, and the consequences were unavoidable. It felt like a declaration of war. If Andrew Harper was going down, he planned to take everyone with him. As Mallory continued reading the divorce petition, I saw its devastating impact. One lawsuit alleged fraud, accusing them of concealing Sophie's true parentage. The potential financial ruin terrified her. If I prevailed, they both faced devastation. Mallory and Andrew had severely underestimated me, clinging to their perception of me as a fool. Saturday descended into chaos for my two oldest children and me. From early morning until late afternoon, a stream of family, Mallory's parents, brothers, sister, and their spouses, arrived offering support and comfort food. Even my own siblings traveled to check on us. Despite everything, we were enveloped in love and support. Everyone struggled to comprehend Mallory's prolonged deception. The social media evidence clearly pointed to her attempts to destroy me, fueled by hatred. My father-in-law and I retreated to the back deck. He urged me to release the burden I carried, assuring me he would handle any further intrusions until I felt better. He remained with me until I calmed down, revealing his intention to alter his will, redirecting Mallory's inheritance to my 3 children. He couldn't forgive her transformation. Later, my dad called to inform me that Sophie's meeting with Mrs. Tate had progressed well. Mrs. Tate had been compassionate and understanding, helping Sophie express her feelings. The lawyer obtained the necessary blood sample and spoke privately with my father about Andrew Harper. My dad shared our knowledge of Andrew's biological father, a man serving a life sentence, and how Sophie's birth complicated his inheritance. I reassured my father that George Thompson had taken legal measures to protect us from Andrew. That day overflowed with visits from both sides of the family, all offering support. My parents stayed at Mrs. Tate's estate with Sophie for the weekend. They enjoyed Mrs. Tate's company and described how Sophie's presence brightened her spirits. My mom spoke with Mrs. Tate, who expressed gratitude for our handling of the situation. She planned to leave everything in trust for Sophie, with me managing it until she turned 25. Before concluding the call, I asked my parents to text me their ETA with Sophie so I could greet them upon arrival. I also messaged Sophie, expressing how much we missed and loved her. We finally had a chance to tidy the house before Mark and Sadie returned my car. I apologized to Sadie for the delay. She mentioned the police chief saw an opportunity to bring down Andrew Harper, collaborating with George, who had supplied potentially incriminating evidence. Mark described a tense atmosphere at the office, with many upset colleagues. Some had known about the situation for most of the week and were offering support. It had been an emotional roller coaster since Thursday night. The kids still struggled, so I decided to take Monday off. Sadie inquired about Mallory, but I hadn't heard from her since Thursday night. I assumed they were busy moving on, having publicly declared their feelings about us. Early Sunday, my youngest called, asking if she and her grandparents could return late Monday. I agreed, pending their approval. She thanked me for encouraging her visit and explained that Mrs. Tate helped her understand that her mother's affair wasn't her fault. She said she loved me before hanging up. Monday evening, Olivia, Elliot, and I waited as my parents pulled into the driveway, looking exhausted. My mom rushed into my arms the moment she exited the car. It was a tremendous relief to have my youngest daughter home. My dad retrieved Sophie's suitcase from the trunk. Elliot took Sophie to her room, where the 3 of them sat down to catch up. Sophie shared stories about meeting her new grandmother. Meanwhile, my parents and I retreated to the kitchen, brewing coffee while we discussed Mrs. Sylvia Tate. She seemed at peace when we left, my dad remarking that meeting Sophie had brought her some closure, and she was ready for what was to come. My mom pulled a legal-sized envelope from her purse and handed it to me. Mrs. Tate's lawyer had given it to me for her instructions. I opened the envelope to find a letter along with a check for $50,000. The letter was brief and to the point. Mrs. Tate thanked me for honoring her request and mentioned how she had lived longer than expected since our first contact. She confirmed the DNA connection and commended me for how I had raised Sophie. She asked me to use the funds to help my family get through the tough times we were facing and to stay true to my values. I let my parents read the letter, and we reflected on how we might have helped fulfill someone's dying wish over coffee. I filled them in on everything that had happened while they were away. I told them I believed the worst of the emotional storm was behind us, and we could finally start getting back to normal, starting the next day. The rest of the week went relatively smoothly. All things considered, Mallory tried reaching out to each of our kids by phone, but they rejected her attempts to reconnect. Meanwhile, corporate headquarters was pleased that I had finally stepped away from managing the sales meetings, and they began searching for a new sales manager, something they hadn't done in over a decade. As I sat in my office reviewing the monthly sales figures, Ruby walked in looking concerned. I asked what was wrong, and she explained that my recent letter to Mallory had been posted online in the opinion section of a regional Kansas newspaper. We quickly pulled up the site and found the letter. Ruby read it aloud, and I nodded, acknowledging that I had written it during a moment of emotional distress. I wondered if I had been too harsh. Ruby shook her head no. The letter just lays out the real of Mallory's actions in a direct way, she said firmly. Either one of them could have ended the affair and come clean, but they didn't. Andrew enjoyed all the benefits without bearing any of the costs. We talked about how rare it is for people to see the fallout from someone's actions in such a public way. Ruby, having gone through her own divorce, said the letter served as a reminder of the pain people go through before finding peace. Then she pointed out a comment on the site from a longtime feminist highlighting how Mallory and Andrew's actions had set back the movement for AAL and empowerment. Later that night, Mallory and Andrew went to Charlie's Bar and Grill for dinner. It was a busy Friday, but they were surprised to find the place unusually empty. When they asked the waitress why it was so quiet, she explained that people were waiting but they refused to be seated near them. Likely most had read the letter I had written to Mallory, now posted on the newspaper website. Feeling uncomfortable, they quickly asked for the check and left as they exited the restaurant. Mallory spotted her parents at a nearby table waiting for their meal. She walked over to greet them with Andrew trailing behind her. Her father, without turning to face her, said coldly, "Mr. Harper, I suggest you take your mistress and leave so my wife and I can enjoy our meal in peace." Mallory left in tears, finally understanding that there was no going back. She would have to live with the consequences of her and Andrew's actions for the rest of her life. Back at Andrew's place, they checked the newspaper website and saw the public's overwhelming disapproval. Their actions had significantly shrunk their social circle. On another front, I sat in the passenger seat of my car, watching as Sophie drove us to Wichita, Kansas. We had received news that her grandmother Sylvia had passed away, and we were heading to the airport to catch the private plane provided by her estate. Sophie was deeply affected, having grown close to her grandmother through their frequent phone calls. Olivia and Elliot had been incredibly supportive, bringing us all closer. They had even started urging me to start dating again, but I was hesitant. Meanwhile, Andrew and Mallory had relocated to St. Louis. Andrew was allowed to start his new federal job early, as the county was eager to get rid of him after paying over $45,000 in questionable expenses. They moved into a small two-bedroom apartment, facing the reality of a potential bankruptcy due to the civil fraud lawsuit under Missouri bankruptcy laws. They were only allowed to keep $1,000 each. Our divorce had been finalized under state law. Mallory was required to pay child support for our kids while they were still in school and cover 50% of their living expenses if they chose to live on campus. The civil trial for fraud was scheduled to begin in 2 weeks. My kids still refused to speak to their mother, and her side of the family had distanced themselves from her. She had learned the hard way that people only tolerate so much before they walk away for good. Sophie had been forced to, Sophie and I attended a state-mandated meeting with her biological father, Andrew, and her mother's side of the family. It didn't go well. Sophie told him in front of child service representatives that both he and her mother were dead to her. We attended her grandmother's funeral, and after the service, the lawyer revealed the substantial inheritance left to Sophie. Overwhelmed by the situation, Sophie and I decided to sell her grandmother's house and most of its contents, keeping only a few pieces of jewelry and some family photos that Sophie wanted. As the school year wrapped up, I began preparing for the first day of the fraud trial set for Wednesday. I was organizing paperwork when Sophie entered the den and asked if I could arrange a meeting with Andrew, Mallory, and George on Tuesday. She wanted them to fully understand the real cost of their actions, an idea inspired by her grandmother, Sylvia. I called George and set it up. On that bright sunny Tuesday, we all sat down for the meeting. Sophie, standing strong, explained that she had called the meeting to address Andrew, her biological father. She handed him a sealed envelope containing information about his own father's location in prison and his request for Andrew to visit him. Sophie disclosed the details of her conception and revealed that her biological grandmother had left her over $1 million in a trust managed by me until she turned 25. This inheritance would have been Andrew's if the truth hadn't been uncovered. She warned both Andrew and Mallory that the legal consequences could escalate if they didn't consider mediation before going to trial. As we left the meeting, I felt proud and humbled. My daughter had spoken her truth, and whatever the future held, I knew I had been given the real blessing.